I left my farm that morning feeling content and expecting the usual calm. My bulls grazing in the fields, the wind rustling gently through the wheat, and my dog Duke trotting along the fences. When I returned that afternoon, I never imagined I'd find my property turned into a full-blown neighborhood festival. It all started as I rolled my pickup truck down the gravel driveway. Normally, I love that final stretch. The familiar crunch under the tires, the clear blue sky overhead, and the sight of rolling fields that belong to me and me alone. It's my favorite part of coming home, the sense of ownership and peace that only farmland can give. But that day, instead of the peaceful view I expected, I saw at least 40 people sprawled across my front pasture. They had set up tents, folding chairs, coolers, and picnic blankets, creating what looked like an upscale party. I spotted fancy wine bottles on tables and multiple grills sending clouds of barbecue smoke into the air. Kids sprinted around wildly, some tramping across my rows of vegetables, squashing tender shoots I'd spent weeks tending. Others were throwing footballs too close to my chicken coop, spooking the hens inside. In the midst of it all stood Diane Whitmore, a woman known in our community for her bold, pushy personality. I'd dealt with her type before, someone who always tries to run the show and claim they know what's best for everyone else. But this was on another level. She was practically orchestrating a carnival right in my own yard, as if I'd handed her an invitation. I parked, shutting off the engine with more force than usual, and Duke leapt out, barking up a storm. Usually, people notice a barking dog, but these folks were too caught up in their wine tasting and gossiping to care. That made me even angrier. I jumped out and slammed the truck door. My boots hit the ground with a thud, and I strode toward Diane, feeling my fists clench at my sides. Finally, she turned my way. "Oh, Jake," she called, wearing a smug little smile. "You're back sooner than we expected. Everything's going wonderfully, don't you think?" My mouth fell open, struggling to find the right words for a moment. "What on earth?" I began, forcing myself not to shout. "Do you think you're doing on my property?" She waved a manicured hand like I was being dramatic. "We just needed a scenic spot for our HOA gathering. The park is so dull and your farmland is gorgeous. Figured we'd use it. No big deal." I stared at her, mind reeling. "No big deal?" I repeated. "This is private land. You can't waltz in with a full-scale party and expect me to be okay with it." Diane shrugged, looking bored. "Relax, Jake. We're only here for a couple hours. Then we'll be out of your hair. You won't even notice us." My jaw tightened. I scanned the scene. A man rummaging around my tractor, a group tying a badminton net to my fence, several children tearing through my vegetables. This wasn't just a quick gathering. They'd set up more like a mini festival. My patience wore thin. "Diane," I said, taking a calming breath, "you have exactly 5 minutes to clear out every last person from my land." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be silly. There's plenty of room here. Why should you care if we use a corner of your pasture? Go inside, have a rest." I gave her a tight smile. "All right," I said quietly. "You don't want to leave? That's your choice." Then I turned on my heel and walked away, ignoring her call of, "Jake, where are you going?" I headed straight for my barn where my bulls were penned. Normally, I lock them up during the day, letting them out each evening into the south pasture so they can roam without disturbing the rest of my farm. They're not bad animals, just protective of their territory. I figured this was the simplest way to show these trespassers that farmland isn't a public park. Duke followed at my heels, still barking. As I approached the heavy wooden gate, I rested my hand on the latch, hearing the bulls snort and scrape the dirt. They sensed a change, probably from my own tense energy. With one pull, I unhooked the latch. Slowly, I eased the gate open. The bulls glanced up, nostrils flaring, and then thundered forward, charging out of the barn with loud snorts. Stepping aside, I let them pass. At first, they only seemed interested in the open pasture, galloping to stretch their legs. But once they spotted a bunch of strangers stomping around, they paused, snorted, and marched farther into the crowd. That was when all heck broke loose. Shrieks filled the air. Lawn chairs flipped. Wine glasses shattered. People who had been calmly chatting suddenly scrambled for cover. A man wearing cargo shorts and flip-flops tried to jump over my fence, clutching a spatula. A group of women screeched and tried diving behind a folding table, which promptly collapsed. One poor soul took a headlong dive into a kiddie pool, arms flailing. I stood near the barn doorway, arms crossed, watching. My bulls, typically calm, snorted and tossed their heads, annoyed by these weird intruders. They weren't attacking anyone, but they did enough stomping and huffing to make everyone think twice about lingering. Diane screeched, "Jake, stop them!" as she stumbled backward in her fancy heels. She lost her footing on a discarded picnic blanket and landed face first in the dirt, letting out a string of curses. A few yard ornaments and baskets of food got knocked over. I saw a platter of fancy cheeses and fruit go flying. Within minutes, the entire crowd bolted toward the line of parked cars along my driveway. People hurriedly gathered their belongings. Some didn't even bother. They just wanted to get away from the bulls. I spotted one father hastily scooping up two crying kids, nearly stumbling as he ran. A woman lost both shoes in the muddy grass while sprinting to safety. Duke barked like mad, enjoying the spectacle. I noticed that none of the bulls were actually hurting anyone. They were simply letting these trespassers know, "You're not welcome here." Mission accomplished. By the time the dust settled, the group had mostly scattered. A few leftover folks tried to gather their coolers and lawn chairs, but the bulls spooked them back toward the cars. Diane, hair askew and dress smudged with mud, faced me with pure anger. "You'll regret this, Jake. I'll call the police, the HOA board, everyone." I leaned against the fence, tipping my hat. Should have thought of that before throwing a random party on someone else's farm. She shook a fist, voice trembling. "This isn't over." Then, glaring around in search of her purse, she stormed off, her friends scuttling after like lost ducks. Eventually, the caravan of vehicles drove away, leaving behind spilled drinks, trampled grass, and my bulls snorting contentedly in the fresh air. I spent the rest of the day cleaning up the mess. Empty bottles, paper plates, and scraps of food scattered across my pasture. I hated that they'd left such a disaster for me to deal with. At least Duke seemed to enjoy the search for leftover scraps, sniffing around with interest. I hoped that was the end of it, but I should have known better. The next morning, while I was enjoying coffee on my porch, a sheriff's cruiser pulled up. The sheriff climbed out, looking both annoyed and apologetic. "Morning, Jake. We got a formal complaint against you." I set my mug aside. "Let me guess. Diane Whitmore?" The sheriff nodded. "She's claiming you put people's lives in danger by deliberately releasing your bulls on them." I rubbed my forehead. "They were trespassing, Sheriff. I told them to leave. They wouldn't. So I opened the barn gate. It's my land. My bulls have free run." He sighed, hands on his hips. "Look, personally, I don't blame you, but Diane's not letting it go. She's got a lawyer friend who's making noise about reckless endangerment and all that. Just be prepared. She's threatening lawsuits." I let out a slow breath, thinking of that woman face-planting in the dirt. Of course she is. Sure enough, a few days later, the town held a public meeting at the community center. Half of the attendees were folks I'd known for years. Farmers, local shop owners, and old friends from around the county. The other half were HOA people, mostly standing behind Diane. She had that same smug expression, as if she'd already won. The mayor, an older man who'd been in office for as long as I could remember, stood at a rickety podium. "All right," he began. "We have a dispute between Jake Simmons and the HOA group represented by Ms. Whitmore. Let's keep this orderly." Diane leapt up, pointing at me. "Orderly? He unleashed wild animals on innocent neighbors. People could have died." I snorted. "They're not wild animals. They're my bulls, and you were on my land." She waved a stack of papers. "I have witness statements. This was reckless, dangerous, and downright criminal." I crossed my arms. "You had no permission to be there. I told you to leave." Around the room, farmers nodded. One older gentleman whispered, "You can't just set up a barbecue on a farm and expect not to face the animals." A group of younger HOA members, however, looked shocked, probably imagining some horror movie scenario. The mayor cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitmore, is it true your group used Jake's land without his consent?" Diane stiffened. "We assumed it was open for community use. There's so much extra space. He's rarely out there." I nearly laughed out loud. "Not being there 24/7 doesn't make it public property." I shook my head, adding, Look, I tried to get them to leave quietly. They refused. The mayor sighed, glancing at some photos Diane had brought, pictures showing the fancy picnic setup. He also glanced at a few pictures I had, showing all the trash and damage they left. He rubbed his temples. Ms. Whitmore, it seems you organized a large event on Jake's farm. Regardless of how you feel about the available space, that's not legally yours to use. Diane's face flushed red. But his response was violent. He released a herd of bulls. I cut in. I let my bulls out to graze, as I do on my own land. If you happen to be standing there, that's on you. A wave of chatter spread through the meeting hall. The mayor tapped his gavel lightly. That's enough. Diane, if you want to pursue this further, do so in court. But as far as I see, Jake was within his rights. He looked at me, a hint of a grin on his face. I can't say I recommend letting bulls loose every time, but I get where you're coming from. Diane stormed out with her supporters, promising again, "This isn't over." I offered the mayor a handshake and left, hoping we'd never have to go through this again. But Diane wasn't done. Within a week, I got official court papers claiming emotional distress, property damage, and some nonsense about a corner of my field not being legally deeded. She tried to argue that it was some leftover chunk of county land. I drove straight to the county records office, where an old friend of my family dug up the original deeds. Everything was perfectly valid. My grandfather had purchased it fair and square, decades back. There was no missing corner. Even so, Diane pressed on. She had a slick lawyer who tried to paint me as a reckless farmer, using bulls like weapons. I hired my own attorney, a local fellow named Ed, who'd seen every petty lawsuit out there. We put together evidence of trespassing and photographs of the party. Ed even got statements from neighbors, who said Diane had planned the gathering days in advance. When the court date arrived, the judge looked exasperated. Todd, Diane's lawyer, rattled off claims about how Mr. Simmons endangered unsuspecting citizens. Ed calmly pointed out all the evidence that Diane was on private property, had no permission, and that my bulls were not wild beasts, but standard farm animals. The judge flipped through the pictures, shaking his head. Ms. Whitmore, you can't hold a giant gathering on private land and then blame the owner for letting out his livestock. Case dismissed. Diane's face turned bright red. She tried to argue, but the judge shut her down with a firm rap of the gavel. I felt a wave of relief as I left the courthouse, neighbors patting me on the back. It was over, at least on paper. Diane might keep being petty, filing small complaints about noisy animals or unpleasant smells, but at least she couldn't steal my land or make me pay for her stupidity. Indeed, from then on, she'd send snippy letters to the town about how farmers should be required to keep quieter livestock, and she'd sometimes glare at me in public. I responded by moving my chicken coop a few yards closer to her property line. If she wanted to experience real country living, that was a good start. I still see her driving by now and then, giving me the evil eye while she passes. I simply tip my hat and wave. My bulls remain happy and free. The orchard is growing nicely, and Duke still runs around barking at whatever he pleases. Life on the farm isn't always easy, but it's mine. And I made it clear that no one can just trespass and turn it into their personal party spot. Sometimes I think back to that day, watching those folks scramble when the bulls came out. Part of me wonders if I overreacted, but most of me knows they had no right to be there, and I gave them fair warning. Letting the bulls loose was a quick way to end the problem. At night, I sit on my porch with Duke, listening to the frogs by the pond and the distant lowing of my cattle. I breathe in the fresh air and remind myself how lucky I am to live here. Yes, folks like Diane might come knocking once in a while, but as long as the deed's in my name, the law's on my side, and I've got bighorn friends willing to greet any uninvited guests. That's enough for me. If anyone else gets the bright idea to host a surprise party on my land, I'll give them a polite warning, just like last time. If they don't listen, well, they'll find out soon enough that messing with a farmer's property is never the best move, and they'll have a stampede of angry bulls to remind them where the line is drawn.